Jake Morrison had spent the better part of 2 years trying to convince himself that the desert could heal him. The Arizona borderlands stretched out in every direction, a vast canvas of sand and scrub brush that seemed to promise something like peace. He'd taken the job with Sentinel Security, hoping the open spaces would quiet the noise in his head, the echo of Fallujah that still woke him most nights drenched in sweat. The work was simple enough. Patrol the perimeter, watch for illegal crossings, file reports. It was honest work, the kind that didn't require him to make impossible decisions or watch good men die for reasons that seemed murkier with each passing year. The sun hung low on the horizon that October evening, painting the landscape in shades of copper and gold. Jake had driven this route 100 times, his truck bouncing over the rutted dirt road that ran parallel to the border fence. He knew every rock formation, every dried creek bed, every place where the desperate and the dangerous tried to slip through. But something was different that day. Maybe it was the way the light caught a shadow that shouldn't have been there, or maybe it was instinct honed by years of combat patrols. Whatever it was, Jake pulled over and grabbed his binoculars. From a distance, it looked like a natural depression in the earth, just another quirk of the landscape. But as Jake walked closer, his boots crunching on the hardpan, he noticed the edges were too uniform, the rocks arranged with too much purpose. He knelt down and brushed away loose dirt, revealing concrete beneath. His heart rate picked up. This wasn't natural. This was engineered. Jake spent the next hour carefully excavating around the structure, documenting everything with his phone camera. What he found made his blood run cold. A steel hatch, camouflaged but recently used based on the fresh scratches around the locking mechanism. Below it, descending into darkness, was a shaft lined with concrete and rebar. This wasn't some amateur smuggling operation. This was infrastructure, professionally built and maintained. He took GPS coordinates, shot dozens of photos from every angle, and marked the location on his personal map. The smart thing would have been to call it in right then. Let the authorities handle it. But Jake had learned in Iraq that sometimes you needed to understand what you were dealing with before you made noise. He returned to his truck and retrieved a flashlight and his sidearm. The hatch required some effort, but it opened. The smell hit him first. Stale air with an undertone of diesel fuel and something else. Something that reminded him of military installations. He descended the ladder, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The tunnel was roughly 8 feet in diameter, high enough to walk through without stooping. LED strip lights lined the ceiling, currently off but wired professionally. The floor was smooth concrete, and Jake could see tire tracks in the fine dust. Recent tracks. He followed the tunnel for maybe 200 yards before his sense of self-preservation kicked in. This went deep, and he was alone. He needed to report this. Needed to bring in people with resources and authority. That night, back in his small rental house in Tucson, Jake couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the tunnel, about the resources required to build something like that. This wasn't just about drugs or human trafficking. This was something bigger, more organized. He'd seen similar networks in Iraq, used by insurgents to move weapons and fighters. The sophistication worried him. At 3 a.m, he gave up on sleep and spent the next several hours compiling his findings into a detailed report. The next day, Jake called his former commanding officer, Colonel Richard Barrett. They'd served together in Ramadi, and Barrett had been the one to write the recommendation that helped Jake land the security contractor job. If anyone would take this seriously, it would be him. They arranged to meet at a diner in Phoenix. Barrett looked older than Jake remembered, his hair completely gray now, his face lined with the weight of command. They shook hands and ordered coffee before Jake spread out the photos on the table. He walked Barrett through everything he'd found, keeping his voice low but urgent. When he finished, he sat back and waited for the colonel's response. Barrett studied the photos for a long moment, then looked up at Jake with something that might have been pity. "Jake, I'm going to be straight with you. How are you sleeping these days? Are you still seeing that therapist the VA set you up with?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow. "Sir, this isn't about PTSD. I found an operational tunnel network. The construction quality alone should tell you this is significant." "What it tells me," Barrett said carefully, "is that you're seeing patterns where there might not be any. The border's full of old infrastructure, abandoned projects, smuggler tunnels that have been there for years. You're taking a few photos and building a narrative around them. With respect, sir, I know the difference between abandoned infrastructure and active operations. There are fresh tire tracks. The hatch has been used recently. The wiring is current generation. Barrett leaned forward, his voice dropping. Listen to me, Jake. You're a good Marine, but you've been through hell. Sometimes our minds play tricks on us when we're looking for a mission, a purpose. I think you should take some time off. Talk to someone. Maybe this contractor work isn't the right fit. Jake felt the walls closing in. You're not going to investigate this? I'll pass it along to the appropriate agencies, but I'm telling you right now, they're going to say the same thing I am. The border's a patchwork of old tunnels and new ones. Without evidence of immediate threat, it's just another data point. And Jake, you need to let this go. For your own good. The drive back to Tucson was a blur. Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles went white. They thought he was crazy. His commanding officer, a man he'd trusted with his life, thought he was having some kind of breakdown. The rage was familiar, the same impotent fury he'd felt when politicians made decisions that got his men killed, when rules of engagement changed based on media coverage instead of tactical reality. But beneath the anger was something worse. Doubt. What if they were right? What if he was seeing threats that weren't there? But when he closed his eyes, he could see that tunnel. He could see the professional construction, the recent activity. That wasn't a hallucination. That was real. Jake's wife, Sarah, was waiting when he got home. She'd been patient through his transition to civilian life, through the nightmares and the silences, through his decision to take a job that kept him away from home for days at a time. But he could see the strain in her eyes, the worry that never quite faded. How did it go? She asked. Jake told her everything, and watched her face fall as he spoke. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Maybe the colonel's right, she finally said. Maybe you should take a break from the border work. Come home for a while. We could use the time together. You think I'm making this up? I think you've been through trauma that would break most people, and I think you're drawn to danger because it's familiar. I think maybe you're looking for a fight because fighting is what you know how to do. The words stung because there was truth in them, but there was also truth in what he'd found. I'm going back, he said. I need to document more of the network. Get evidence that can't be dismissed. Sarah's expression hardened. And what happens to us while you're chasing shadows in the desert? What happens to our marriage? This isn't about chasing shadows. This is about a real threat. Then let someone else handle it. Let the authorities do their job. You've done yours by reporting it. But Jake knew no one was going to follow up. Barrett had made that clear. If Jake wanted this investigated, he'd have to do it himself. Over the next 2 weeks, Jake became intimate with the tunnel network. He went during his off hours, careful not to let his employer know what he was doing. He'd learned to navigate by the network's internal logic, following the main arteries that branched into smaller passages. The system was enormous, far more extensive than he'd initially realized. Some sections looked older, rough-cut and primitive, but the newer sections, the ones with professional lighting and ventilation, those were what worried him. He found supply caches, water, MREs, medical supplies, ammunition. He found evidence of regular maintenance, tools and equipment neatly stored. Most disturbing, he found sleeping quarters that had been used recently, military-style cots with blankets still folded. This wasn't a smuggling route. This was staging infrastructure. Jake documented everything, building a comprehensive map of the network. He installed motion-activated trail cameras at key junctions, covering them with camouflage netting. The evidence piled up, but so did his isolation. Sarah had stopped asking about his investigations, retreating into hurt silence. His employer was growing suspicious about his request for unusual shift patterns, and when he tried to share his findings with local law enforcement, he got the same response. Thanks for the report. We'll look into it. His former unit brothers were worse. When Jake reached out to guys he'd served with, men he'd bled alongside, they were polite but distant. Word had spread about his tunnel obsession. They thought he'd lost it, that he was having a breakdown. The invitations to reunions stopped coming. The group chat went quiet when he posted. He was becoming a cautionary tale, the guy who couldn't let go of the war. The loneliness was crushing. Jake had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on not needing validation from others. But being treated like you're delusional by everyone you trust, that was a special kind of torture. He started to question himself in the small hours of the morning. Maybe he was reading too much into normal border activity. Maybe the trauma had rewired his brain in ways he didn't understand. Maybe he should just let it go and try to save his marriage. But then he'd review the footage from his trail cameras and see figures moving through the tunnels, organized and purposeful. He'd see the fresh supply drops, the evidence of systematic preparation. And he'd know, with a certainty that went bone deep, that he was right. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Gonzalez was a 26-year-old Border Patrol agent, 3 years into her career and still idealistic enough to believe the system worked. She'd grown up in Nogales, understood the border in her blood, and took her job seriously. When her sector started reporting unusual activity, electromagnetic anomalies that didn't match known smuggling patterns, she started asking questions. Maria had heard about Jake Morrison, the crazy ex-Marine who thought he'd found some kind of underground invasion route. Most of her colleagues dismissed him as a burnout, but something about the story nagged at her. She pulled up his initial reports, studied the photos he'd submitted, and compared them to the anomaly patterns her team was tracking. The correlation was impossible to ignore. She found Jake at a gas station near the border, filling up his truck. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Agent Gonzalez, Border Patrol. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Jake's first instinct was suspicion. Another official ready to tell him he was crazy? But something in Maria's eyes, a sharp intelligence and genuine curiosity, made him agree. They sat in her patrol vehicle, and Jake walked her through everything he'd found. Maria listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small leather-bound book. When Jake finished, she pulled out her tablet and showed him sensor data from the last 6 weeks. "This is electromagnetic activity we've been tracking. Our equipment picks up unusual power draws underground, in patterns that suggest active electrical systems. Your tunnel network matches almost perfectly with our anomaly clusters." For the first time in weeks, Jake felt vindicated. "You believe me. I believe the data. And the data says you found something significant. But I need to warn you, my chain of command is going to be skeptical. A lot of the senior agents think the new sensor equipment gives false positives. If we're going to push this up, we need irrefutable evidence." They formed an unlikely partnership. Maria had access to sophisticated tracking equipment and official authority. Jake had intimate knowledge of the tunnel network and combat experience that Maria lacked. Together, they started building a case that couldn't be ignored. They worked carefully, documenting everything according to proper protocols. Maria brought in a trusted colleague, an older agent named Carlos who'd worked the border for 20 years and knew how to navigate the bureaucracy. They compiled sensor data, Jake's photographic evidence, and physical samples from the tunnels. Carlos had contacts in various agencies, and he started making quiet inquiries, testing the waters to see who might be receptive to their findings. The pushback was immediate and intense. Maria's supervisor called her in and told her to drop it, that she was jeopardizing her career by associating with that conspiracy theorist Morrison. Carlos got similar pressure from his command. The message was clear: let it go or face consequences. But Maria had her father's stubborn streak. He'd been a Marine too, killed in action in Afghanistan when she was 12. She joined Border Patrol partly to honor his memory, to protect the country he'd died for. And she knew, in the way her father had taught her to trust her instincts, that this was real. "We need to go outside normal channels," she told Jake and Carlos one evening, meeting in Jake's living room because it felt safer than anywhere official. "I have a contact at DHS, a senior analyst who specializes in infrastructure threats. She owes me a favor, and more importantly, she's not political. If we can get this directly to her, bypassing the local bureaucracy, we might have a shot." It took 3 weeks to arrange the meeting. Jake spent that time in agony, watching his marriage continue to deteriorate while he chased vindication. Sarah had moved into the spare bedroom, and they spoke in careful, distant tones when they spoke at all. His employer had given him a final warning about his unauthorized activities. Everything was falling apart, but Jake couldn't stop. The tunnel network had become an obsession, but it was an obsession rooted in truth. The DHS analyst's name was Catherine Chen, and she met them at a secure facility in Phoenix. She was in her 40s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of calm competence that inspired confidence. Maria made the presentation, walking Catherine through the evidence methodically and professionally. Jake added technical details, describing the tunnel construction and comparing it to what he'd seen in Iraq. Carlos provided the institutional context, explaining why the local agencies had dismissed the findings. Catherine asked pointed questions, took extensive notes, and requested copies of everything. "I'll need to verify this independently," she said when they finished. "But if what you're showing me is accurate, this represents a significant security vulnerability. I'll need 72 hours to run this through our systems and coordinate with other agencies. Don't do anything else in the meantime. No more tunnel explorations. No more evidence gathering. You've done enough, and I don't want you compromising an investigation or getting hurt." The 72 hours felt like 72 years. Jake tried to be normal, to focus on his regular patrols, but his mind kept returning to the tunnels. What was happening down there right now? Were they moving weapons, fighters, planning something catastrophic? The not knowing was torture. On the third day, Catherine called Maria. "You need to come back to Phoenix. Bring Morrison and Carlos, and you should probably bring a lawyer." Jake's stomach dropped. This was it. Either vindication or the final nail in his career coffin. They made the drive in tense silence. Catherine met them in a different facility this time, a bunker-like structure with multiple security checkpoints. When they finally got to her office, there were other people waiting. Military intelligence officers, FBI agents, someone from Homeland Security. The room crackled with contained urgency. "Your tunnel network is real," Catherine said without preamble. "And it's worse than you thought. We've been monitoring communications intercepts for the last 18 months, tracking a sophisticated organization planning a coordinated cross-border operation. We knew they were planning something, but we couldn't figure out the how. Your tunnels are the how." One of the military intelligence officers, a colonel named Reeves, took over the briefing. "We're looking at a multi-pronged assault designed to overwhelm border security at several points simultaneously. The tunnel network would allow insertion of personnel and equipment without triggering surface sensors. Intelligence suggests the operation is scheduled for the next 2 to 3 weeks. Jake felt lightheaded. "I tried to tell Colonel Barrett about this weeks ago. He thought I was having a breakdown." Reeves grimaced. "Barrett's going to have to answer some difficult questions about that. But right now, we need your help. You know these tunnels better than anyone. We need tactical intelligence, entry points, choke points, places where we can interdict and contain. We have maybe 10 days to prepare, and we're starting from zero." Everything changed overnight. Jake went from being dismissed as crazy to being essential. Military and intelligence agencies descended on southern Arizona in force. Jake spent 12-hour days briefing tactical teams, walking them through the tunnel layouts, identifying strategic positions. The trail cameras he'd installed became crucial intelligence sources, providing real-time updates on activity in the network. Maria and Carlos were vindicated too, though Maria's supervisor was conspicuously absent from the operation. Carlos became a liaison between Border Patrol and the military response teams. They worked around the clock, fueled by coffee and adrenaline and the knowledge that they'd been right all along. Sarah showed up at the operations center on the 5th day. Jake hadn't seen her in over a week, too busy to even go home most nights. She looked tired and sad, and something else, something that might have been pride. "They called me," she said. "Official channels telling me where you were and what you were doing, explaining that you'd uncovered a significant threat and were providing critical support to the response." "I wasn't crazy," Jake said, and hated how much he needed her to acknowledge it. "No, you weren't. And I'm sorry I doubted you. I'm sorry I let my fear override my trust. But Jake, this cost us something. Even if you were right, even if you saved lives, we lost time we can't get back." "I know. And when this is over, we need to figure out if we can repair that. But right now, I have to finish this." Sarah nodded and left, and Jake didn't know if he'd see her again. The operation went down on a cold November night. Jake wasn't on the assault teams, but he coordinated from the command center, watching multiple video feeds as special operations forces moved through the tunnels he'd discovered. They'd identified the main staging areas, the points where hostile forces were gathering for their planned incursion. The engagement was swift and professional. The element of surprise was complete. The hostile forces, expecting an uncontested approach, instead ran into overwhelming force in confined spaces where their numbers meant nothing. It was over in less than 3 hours, with minimal casualties on the American side and complete disruption of the planned operation. Jake watched it unfold on screens, feeling oddly disconnected. This was what vindication looked like, but it felt hollow. He'd been right, yes. He'd potentially saved countless lives, yes. But the cost had been measured in relationships destroyed, trust broken, months of isolation and doubt. Colonel Barrett showed up at the command center as the operation wound down. He looked older still, diminished somehow. "Morrison, I owe you an apology. I should have listened. I should have investigated. My failure to take your report seriously could have resulted in catastrophe." "Yes, sir, it could have. I let my assumptions about PTSD cloud my judgment. I saw what I expected to see instead of what you were showing me." "That's a failure of leadership, and I'll have to answer for it." Jake nodded, too tired for anger. "The system failed, sir. Not just you. Everyone I reported this to dismissed it. Maybe we need to think about why that is. Why someone with direct evidence of a threat gets treated like they're delusional." "We will. There's going to be a comprehensive review of how this intelligence was handled, or mishandled. Your role in discovering and documenting the threat is going to be part of the official record. For what it's worth, you did everything right. You persevered when everyone told you to quit. That took courage." The recognition felt strange, coming so late. Jake thought about all the nights he'd lain awake, questioning himself, all the relationships that had been damaged, all the moments when it would have been so much easier to just let it go. The next few weeks were a blur of debriefings and reports. Jake's tunnel documentation became classified material, studied by analysts and engineers trying to understand how such an extensive network had been built without detection. Maria got promoted, her instinct to investigate vindicated by results. Carlos retired on his own terms, satisfied that he'd done one last important thing before leaving the job. Jake's employer offered him a promotion and a raise. The VA called to congratulate him and offer upgraded mental health services, which was almost funny. His former unit brothers reached out, apologetic and embarrassed. The group chat came alive again, full of messages about always knowing he had it in him, always knowing he was solid. But Jake couldn't quite accept the congratulations, couldn't fully embrace the vindication, because the truth was messier than the neat narrative everyone wanted to tell. Yes, he'd been right. Yes, he'd discovered a significant threat. But he'd also become obsessed, had damaged his marriage, had isolated himself in ways that went beyond what the situation required. The line between justified persistence and harmful obsession was thinner than he'd realized. Sarah agreed to counseling, and they started the hard work of rebuilding trust. It was slow and painful, full of difficult conversations about boundaries and communication, and what it meant to be partners when one of them was carrying trauma that sometimes overwhelmed everything else. Jake didn't know if they'd make it, but he was willing to try. He took a leave of absence from Sentinel security and spent time just being still, something he'd never been good at. He drove through the desert sometimes, out to where he'd found that first tunnel entrance, and thought about the strange path that had led him there. He'd been looking for purpose in the borderlands, for some way to make sense of his post-war life. He'd found it, but not in the way he'd expected. Catherine Chen called him 6 months after the operation. "We're setting up a new program," she said, focused on identifying and analyzing infrastructure threats, particularly in border regions. "We need people who can think creatively, who can see patterns others miss, who have operational experience. We need someone to lead the field assessment team." Interested, Jake thought about it for a week, talked it through with Sarah and his therapist. The work would mean travel, would mean long hours and pressure and the kind of intense focus that had nearly cost him his marriage. But it would also mean purpose, would mean using his skills in a way that mattered, would mean being part of something larger than himself. "On 2 conditions, he told Catherine. 1, I bring Maria Gonzalez with me. She was the first person to believe me, and she has skills this program needs. 2, the team includes mandatory psychological support, real support, not just check-the-box bureaucracy. If we're asking people to be vigilant about threats, we need to help them stay healthy while they do it." Catherine agreed to both conditions, and Jake found himself with a new mission. The work was challenging and meaningful, and he was good at it. His team discovered 3 more tunnel networks in the first year, helped interdict several major smuggling operations, and developed protocols that other agencies adopted. But the most important thing Jake learned wasn't about tunnels or threats or tactical intelligence. It was about the cost of being right, about the price of persistence, about the importance of balance. He'd been vindicated, yes. He'd been proven right in the face of universal doubt. But he'd also learned that being right wasn't enough, that how you pursued truth mattered as much as the truth itself. He thought about that a lot, especially when new team members came aboard. eager and driven and maybe a little too willing to sacrifice everything for the mission. He told them about the tunnels, about being dismissed and doubted, about the vindication that came too late to prevent all the damage. But he also told them about Sarah, about the relationships he'd nearly destroyed, about the importance of staying human even when hunting threats. The desert still called to him sometimes, vast and harsh and beautiful in its indifference. Jake would stand on the ridge where he'd first found the tunnel entrance and marvel at how much had changed. He'd come to the borderlands looking for peace and found war instead. He'd been called crazy when he was actually the only sane person in the room. He'd lost almost everything proving he was right, and gained it back only by accepting that righteousness alone wasn't enough. The tunnels were sealed now, filled with concrete and monitored by sensors. The threat had been neutralized, at least for now. But Jake knew there would be others, that the work of vigilance never really ended. The question wasn't whether threats existed, but how to face them without losing yourself in the process. That was the real challenge, the one that didn't come with medals or commendations, the one that required different kind of courage than he'd learned in Fallujah. He went home to Sarah that evening, to the house they'd almost lost to his obsession and her doubt, and he was grateful for another day of getting it right, or at least trying to. The war in Iraq was over for him, but the war to stay whole and healthy and connected, that was the fight that would never end. And unlike the tunnels, unlike the vindication, that was a battle he couldn't afford to lose.